Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Horner. I'm the Director of Education here at Emory's Michael C. Carlos Museum, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's AntiquiTEA program. We're really thrilled to have two wonderful Emory faculty members, great scholars. Scott Kugle is Professor of Islamic Studies and South Asian Studies, and Roxani Margariti is Associate Professor of Middle Eastern Studies. And when we first thought that we might be able to bring this exhibition to the Carlos Museum, I met with Roxani, and she was flipping through the catalog, and she saw this painting of the legend of the splitting of the moon. And she got so animated and so excited because she and Scott had just published a scholarly article on this very topic. And so it's one of the great joys of the Carlos Museum when we can share the scholarship of Emory faculty with a larger public audience. And so I'm terribly grateful to the two of them for making time for this in this challenging year. I hope that all of you will put questions in the Q&A function of Zoom, and I will feed them live at the end of the program, and Scott and Roxani can answer them live. And just one other thing for those of you who may not have heard, the Carlos Museum is now open again to the public. We are thrilled. Reservations are required in order to make sure that the numbers are low and that you are safe. So please visit carlos.emory.edu to make a reservation and come and see this beautiful exhibition. And I'll turn it over now to Roxani and Scott. Thank you both.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Well, welcome, everybody. We can't see you, but we're very grateful that you are joining us this afternoon. Our thanks to the Michael C. Carlos Museum, and especially to Elizabeth Horner, whose inspired leadership brought this exhibition to campus, and in the process revealed to us marvelous and little-known artifacts in the Newark Museum of Art's Islamic collection. Some of those, as Elizabeth just mentioned, turn out to link directly with our own specialized research. And among them is the painting at the center of our talk this afternoon. So my colleague and dear friend, Scott Kugle, and I would like to share some thoughts about the connection between this painting and a foundation story of Islam's arrival to India, the story that we had just published when Elizabeth brought the exhibition to us. So this delightful painting, again, from the Islamic art collection of the Newark Museum of Art, now on view at our museum here on campus. And I hope you will all come and examine it up close. As Elizabeth said, the museum is now welcoming everyone, registration required. As you see here on the slide, the exhibition catalog identifies the figure in the painting tentatively as a saint, poet, or ruler. The author points to the split moon motif and refers to something called the splitting of the moon in the Qur'an and in the poetry of the Islamicate world. Other significant aspects of this painting that you see here are obviously the natural setting, the palm tree, the verdant earth, the water-laden cumulus clouds, and of course, the lavish garb and headgear and the throne on which our central figure sits. Now, our interpretation and our excitement when we saw this painting coming to us goes back to the text that came to our attention as we taught the history of the Middle East and South Asia through the lens of the Indian Ocean region, the Indian Ocean and its connectivities and its civilizations. That text told the story of how Islam first took root in India. As you will see, the story links an Indian king with the miracle of the splitting of the moon. So we would like to share our reading of this painting's indeed rare and marvelous details through the testimony of that text. Who is the painting's handsome subject? Saint, poet, or ruler? We say ruler, you'll see why. What is the landscape in which he is depicted? We say South India, you'll see why. And how does it fit with the history as well as the legendary echoes of Islam's arrival in India? Now a map, just to situate us and to note how the Indian Ocean, and particularly its western, northwestern reaches, highlight the Middle East and South Asia's nexus, the way that they are interconnected. It is through this nexus of the Indian Ocean that Islam spread along the ocean's shores, primarily through trade, and the circulation of Muslim scholars and mystics. Here, from the 8th century on, Islam increasingly became a main strand of connectivity in this trans-regional arena. This is what one scholar has recently called Monsoon Islam. Islam traveled along routes of trade that became more dense from the 10th century on, bringing on increasing economic integration of the worlds of the Indian Ocean with the worlds of the Mediterranean, and creating a kind of Afro-Eurasian world, and eventually leading to globalization, we could say. Now the text. The two extant manuscripts, both of them are in the British Library, that contain our text, date to the late 18th and the mid-19th century, respectively. On your screen, you see the earlier, the 18th century copy. This one was collected by British East India Company types, probably in South India, while the other manuscript was copied at the order of colonial administrators as the British grip on the subcontinent grew tighter through the course of the 1800s. But the text recorded in these manuscripts clearly dates to a much earlier period, and we argue it goes back to at least the 16th century. In that period, the 16th century, another version of this story appears in an Indian Muslim history of Islam in India called The Gift of the Holy Warriors, Tuhfat al-Mujahideen. You will hear more about this production period of the text from Scott in the second part of our talk. As for the narrative itself, as I hinted above, it is the foundation story of Islam in India. It involves an Indian ruler, and it involves the Prophet Muhammad's miracle of the splitting of the moon. The narrative has a kind of cinematic quality to it. It begins in 7th century Arabia, in Islam's epicenter, the city of Mecca, just as the Prophet Muhammad is getting started on his missions to bring God's message to the Arabs. In vivid dialogue, the text elaborates on standard biographical details of the Prophet's life. Particularly, the text starts at the very tense moment, a crucial moment in the Prophet's biography, in which the Prophet is facing challenges and scorn from members of his own tribe, the Quraysh, who reject his prophethood outright. A mediator between the Prophet and the opponents determines that there is a solution, and that solution is for the Prophet to produce a miracle, a peculiar miracle that calls for the Prophet to converse with the moon as it rises on the sky, for the moon to descend and pass through the sleeves of the Prophet's robe, and then split in half, and finally to reascend with the two halves reuniting in the night sky. Against the odds, the miracle is performed, a grace granted by God to his Prophet as he faced off his opponents in Mecca. Now here, this is just the first two pages of the text, then the narrative suddenly shifts, camera-like kind of, and it shifts from Arabia to Western India. Quote, on that very night, God, by his divine power, displayed this miracle of the splitting of the moon to the ruler of India, Li Sultan al-Hind, is how the text puts it. So this king, whom the text identifies as Chakravarti Farmad, and here Chakravarti really is the Arabized version of the Indic title Chakravarti, world ruler. And as we will see, again, I'll leave this to Scott to show you a little more on this. For the figure of this king can also be, is identified with the name Chakravarti Cheruman Perumal. So this great Indian king observes the miracle of the splitting of the moon all the way across the Arabian Sea at his home in Kodangalore on India's Pepper Coast, and he recognizes it for what it is, a divine sign. A dream of the prophet follows. And now the king is stricken with such love for the prophet that, quote, he no longer ate or drank or took delight in bed, end of quote. This ardent desire for Islam and its prophet drives the king to leave all of his possessions and to travel to find the prophet in Mecca. In Mecca, Muhammad receives the king and introduces him to his companions. He says to them that here is the great king from the land of pepper and ginger, the land of India at Malabar, end of quote. That's how he describes him. And this is a clear echo of the historical reality of trade and exchange that I spoke about earlier. The historical reality of the quickening and increasing spice trade, and clearly it is a bit of an anachronism because this would not have been the reality in 7th century Arabia. Accepting his conversion, Muhammad gives Chakravarti Farmad the Muslim name Taj ad-Din al-Malabari al-Hindi, the crown of religion, the Malabar king, the Indian, the Malabari, the Indian. And it is now time for our hero to return to India and spread the word in his land. So the king leaves Mecca. He's accompanied by trusted companions of the prophet and heads to India by land and then by ship. But on the way, he falls ill. And in order to ensure he sees the end is near, he's still in Arabia. And in order to ensure that his companions do reach the destination and spread the word of Islam, he gives them a script in the writ of India, as the text says. He gives them instructions and bequests that will allow them, not him, them who are going on, traveling to India to take root in a new land. So what we see here is that the first Indian Muslims, the first Muslims to arrive in India and to be the progenitors of the Muslim community in India, have both Arabian heritage and royal Indian sanction, right? A writ in the script of India, as the text puts it. Indeed, they go on to found new communities on the shores of the subcontinent. The string of ports where they settle, as the text tells us, corresponds neatly with the ports where Muslims, but also Jewish, Arabic-speaking traders from the Arabian Peninsula, the Middle East, the Mediterranean world, had been trading and settling since at least the 10th century, and Christian also communities too, as part of a great spice trade that linked the Indian Ocean with the rest of the world. Now, this is the story. The story does not appear in non-Indian versions of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, nor does it appear in the illustrated versions of the Prophet's biographies, as far as we know. The image of the splitting of the moon does not appear on those. You see here a illustration from a Turkish, an Ottoman Turkish language version of the life of the Prophet, with the Prophet in the middle, presented veiled, and the Archangel Gabriel presenting to him the revelation that is to become the Quran, presenting to him one part of the Quran. But again, no trace in at least the original, the earliest biography of the Prophet, of the story of the splitting of the moon, and of course not the Indian king. The splitting of the moon story does, however, appear elliptically in the Quran, and that's the origin of the tale as it develops through time. Quran 54 verses 1 to 3, the surah of the moon reads, the hour drew nigh and the moon was split in two. اقتربت الساعة وانكشت وانشق القمر. Yet, whenever they see a sign, they turn away and say, prolonged magic. They denied the truth and followed their own desires, but every matter will be settled. This is a verse about divine signs and about the end of times, delivered as a warning to people to repent. People do not heed the warnings, such as the people who oppose the Prophet Muhammad. So there's something apocalyptic, eschatological about this verse. And attempting to interpret this kind of elliptic reference to the splitting of the moon, the Islamic exegetical tradition developed the story of the splitting of the moon as a historical rather than an allegorical eschatological event, and firmly associated it with the life of the Prophet Muhammad. As one scholar who studied the development of the miracle stories that are associated with Muhammad puts it, in these traditions, the celestial phenomenon itself is an intentional splitting apart of the moon. The verb inshiqaq is transformed here from figurative to literal, and the event changes from a sign that Muhammad simply interprets into a miracle of the most powerful kind. This transformation is noticeable in the earliest available tafsir compilations. That's this exegetical tradition that develops the story of the splitting of the moon. While the story of the splitting of the moon then develops textually in the Islamic exegetical tradition, iconographically little survives, except, interestingly enough, in books of divination or falnames. That's my next slide here. A falname is part of a genre that is quite varied, but one of its forms compiles different stories, images, and symbols that are then used in pious instruction and prediction of the future. In this falname, this fantastic picture from the 16th century, a Persian manuscript that shows the prophet veiled, again, pointing to the moon, pointing to the split moon, the miracle validating his prophethood. So, Scott, I think, what about the other falname, the one that's missing the prophet, but, showing a splendid moon?
Yeah, so this is an image from another falname where you can see that the moon has taken on, a face. And so often the moon is pictured not just as a silvery disk, but as a person. This is a falname, or a book of omens, that is from India, again, 16th century text. And it explains that if you see the full moon in your fal, in an omen, it's a really good sign. And in the beginning, there's a quote from the Qur'an from a different chapter. This is from Surat Yasin, chapter 36, that mentions the moon. And it says, وَالْقَمَرْ قَدَرْنَاهُ مَنَازِلَ حَتَّى عَادَ إِلَى أَرْجُونَ الْقَدِيمِ. And the moon, we, God, empowered it to move through its phases or its stages until it returns full as it had been. And then the text explains that this is a great omen. If you see it, you will eat from the date palm of joy and delight. You will pluck a bud from hope's garden quite soon. Bar nakhale tarabo aish bikhwahi khurdan kali az gulshane umid bikhwahi burdan. So the imagery, of the moon is thus really, really important. And this was painted in the 16th century, which is a time of cataclysmic change, political change for the Muslims of Malabar, the Pepper Coast, as we'll see in the next slide. So the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama had landed in Malabar. He landed actually at the town of Calicut, which is there on this map, in 1498. And he demanded that the Hindu king, the Zamorin, who ruled over Calicut, expel all of the Muslim and Arab merchants that were doing business there, who made the Zamorin's kingdom of Calicut so prosperous. And when the king, although he was a Hindu, refused to take action against the Muslim merchants who gave his place such prosperity, the Portuguese began to wage war. They bombarded Calicut, targeting the town's biggest mosque, and they cut off international trade from the Indian Ocean, seriously undermining the prosperity of Muslim communities in this South Indian pepper-producing region. The Ottoman Empire took an interest in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea trade routes and sent several naval expeditions to try to oppose the Portuguese dominance. But coordination with other Muslim sultans in India and as far away as Aceh in Sumatra and Indonesia, which also appears on this map, that kind of coordination was hard to engineer, and the Portuguese proved stubborn in their control. The Muslims of Kerala, around the city of Calicut, were known as Mappilas. They took matters into their own hands and organized their own navy called the Marakkars. These were naval commanders who set off in small crafts to try to keep the trade routes open. Although they had local success, the Portuguese actually never conquered Calicut, but it made them long for a Muslim king who was powerful and could come to their rescue. And so these dreams and legends of a Muslim king in their region began to circulate, actually in the absence of a strong Muslim king that could protect their interests. Mm-hmm. In the next slide, in this context, whoops, go back one. In this context, we find the circulation of the story of Chakravarti Faramad, as Roxani was explaining to us. That's an Arabic rendition of the name Chakravarti Cheruman Perumal. Of course, the Arabs can't say P or O, these Indian sounds, so they translate it as Faramad. It's very interesting to see how the Arabic script changes the way the name is rendered, but it's fairly easy for somebody who knows Sanskrit and Malayalam to see the underlying name of Chakravarti Cheruman Perumal under the name of the Arabic name Chakravarti Faramad. But this story then moved, we conjecture, in this era from being oral lore, a story told about the past, to being a written legend, such as we found in these Arabic manuscripts in libraries in London. We can also look not only for texts, but for material traces of this Indian king. And in the next slide, you'll see an actual building. The earliest mosque in India was in Malabar. It's called the Cheruman Perumal Mosque. It was built, according to oral stories, in 1629 CE, very early. And it was built by the Arab missionaries coming back coming to India with the writ of that Indian king who had died in Arabia, never made it back, but he sent letters of introduction and authorization to allow Arabs to settle at the various ports up and down the Malabar coast. And this mosque was supposedly the first one built at the city of Kudungallur, which was known as Muziris in Greek or Mahudayapuram in Sanskrit. It was the major capital of the Cheruman Perumal's kingdom. This is an archival photograph from the Madras Courier newspaper. If we see on the next slide that the architecture has changed considerably into the modern era. This is a picture that I took just a few years ago when I was there in Kudungallur. But you can see on the gateway, Cheruman Masjid, the name has stayed the same. The site, we can say, is the oldest mosque site in India, even though the building has been continually modernized. And as Roxani mentioned, the Arabic legend says that 10 mosques were founded up and down the coast. This would be the primary one because this town had been the capital city and the trade center of the region. But it lost its place. Kudungallur is no longer a major town. And the river that it had been on shifted and silted up, and other ports took over the trade. And actually the city of Calicut blossomed in the era after Kudungallur. And the story of Cheruman Perumal is actually connected to the founding of the town of Calicut, because supposedly the letters of the king when he went to Arabia and sent missionaries back, he had divided the realm amongst his family members. So up and down the coast, you had little chieftains, but the king had a general who he had sent out to war. And the general was not around when the land was divided. He came back to the coast later when the king was about to leave on his trip to Arabia. Not having any more land to give, the king gave his sword instead and said to him, "Conquer land if you can, but always remember that the sea is more valuable than the land." That general then conquered a coastal strip, which is known as Calicut, and that became a very prosperous town. And of course, the sea lanes proved to be much more valuable than the land. This is the legend of the founding of the Calicut town. Calicut is still a thriving port town. This is a picture of the old Arab quarter of the town where the Muslim merchants lived. It's called Kutichira, and it's centered on a freshwater reservoir, which you can see here with some mosques, schools, libraries, Sufi tombs, and coffee houses all around it. And just behind the person taking this picture would be the Grand Mosque of the Arab Quarter, which we'll see in the next slide. This is the Mythical Masjid, or in Malayalam, it's called Mishkalpali. And it was built by a great ship owner, a very wealthy merchant around 1340, whose name was Nahuda Mythkal. Nahuda means an admiral or a ship navigator, a ship owner. And he used his wealth to build this grand mosque. This is the one that Vasco da Gama targeted when he bombarded Calicut's Muslim quarter. It was bombarded by the Portuguese in 1510, but it was rebuilt again in 1578 by the Muslim residents of Calicut in a show of defiance against the Portuguese. The next slide. The roof of this mosque, it actually used to be 7 stories tall with 7 different roofs, but it's now about 4 roofs tall because the rebuilding was not quite as grand as the original building. And it was in this era of competition with the Portuguese and Muslim naval corsairs fighting back against the Portuguese and longing for a Muslim king that would help them, that the first history of this region of Malabar was written in Arabic by a Sufi and a scholar named Zainuddin Malabari. Zainuddin wrote this book, Tuhfatul Mujahideen, or Gift of the Holy Warriors, reporting the Portuguese terrors. And Roxani had mentioned it earlier in the talk. It was written as a history of the Muslims of this region, and it includes the legend of the king who converted at the sighting of the split moon. But it was also written and dedicated to the nearest Muslim sultan that there was, the Sultan of Bijapur. And he was a very powerful king in the Deccan Plateau. The writer Zainuddin Ma'abari, he dedicated the book to that king of Bijapur, probably hoping that the king of Bijapur would oppose the Portuguese and drive them off the coast and be the savior of his own Malabar Muslim community. We can move on to the next slide. But in fact, the Sultan of Bijapur had made his peace with the Portuguese and was harried rather by the expanding Mughal empire that was pushing south from the Mughal capitals in Agra and Delhi. And here we see a portrait that is in the Wondrous Worlds exhibition. It's part of the Newark Museum's collection of the last great Mughal emperor, Aurangzeb. And Aurangzeb, when he was a younger man than he appears in the picture, was the governor of the Deccan province and had the great dream of conquering Bijapur and the other little Muslim kings of South India, which he eventually did. These areas, Bijapur and other sultanates in South India, were conquered by the Mughals. And so Zainuddin Ma'abari, the scholar who wrote that Arabic text, wanting help from his local Muslim kings, was frustrated in his designs by Mughal dominance. Now, when we look at this portrait of Aurangzeb when he's older, we can see the symbolism of the throne is very important. The Mughals sat on thrones and they had footstools. This symbolized the might and power of a Muslim king in the Mughal era. And when we refer back to our beautiful painting of the mythical king seeing the splitting of the moon, we can see that the throne is also a very important part of the painting. The throne and the footstool, it echoes Mughal royal imagery. And this is why Roxani, Margariti, and I, when we looked at this painting closely, we thought, we don't think this is a prophet or a saint, because the Prophet Muhammad was not depicted in this era sitting on a throne, and he was more often than not depicted with his face covered by a veil. So we thought, no, this depicts a Mughal era imagination of a legendary king who is pointing at the moon, not to split it like the prophet, but to indicate that he saw it and he understood its signs and he followed its guidance. We also think that the book he's holding in his hand might be a Qur'an. And again, the Prophet Muhammad would never be shown holding the book of the Qur'an because it didn't exist as a book when the Prophet was receiving revelations. And when we looked at this image carefully, my colleague Roxani was paying attention not just to the moon, which looks dark in the picture, but was actually silver. The silver has tarnished and darkened. So you have to imagine that that split moon was a silvery moon. But even above that, she's so acute in her vision that she said, are those clouds up above? And I said, certainly they're clouds, you know. There's not much of a landscape there, but those must be cumulonimbus clouds. And she said, no, they look like waves. I think that's the ocean. We had a long extended argument about whether those were clouds or the ocean. But at the end of our discussion, I think she's right. If this is the king of Malabar and he's got his throne on the coast, then it would be waves, not necessarily clouds that are there on the horizon. So we've got a little bit further to go in our journey. And I want to look at a couple more slides here, because the Mughals never held South India for very long. When Aurangzeb expanded the empire so far to the south, it really exceeded his control. And small kingdoms broke off. The area that had been Bijapur became the kingdom of Mysore, ruled by Hyder Ali and his son Tipu Sultan, legendary kings of South India. And they invaded the Pepper Coast and took control of Malabar and its major city of Calicut in 1766. This is important to our story because Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan continued the Mughal tradition of ruling from a magnificent throne. His throne was really imaginative. He was called the Tiger King, and he actually had a golden throne that was, instead of having legs like a chair, it had tigers, and also a golden parasol with a huma bird, a legendary bird that granted the people under it the right to rule as a king. We see some rather crude painting on the right of that gold throne with Tipu Sultan sitting on it, and a British era watercolored engraving of Tipu Sultan on the left. So Tipu Sultan, when he conquered Malabar, he became the first king who was a Muslim to ever rule this region, which was the first place where Muslims lived and built mosques in the whole Indian subcontinent. So it took a very long time for the Muslims of Malabar to get a Muslim king. But when they finally got one under Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, they had a king who ruled from a throne. So we conjecture that this painting is a late Mughal era painting, maybe even a painting from the time of the rulers of Mysore. Tipu Sultan and his legendary throne were destroyed by the East India Company, the British colonial company, who attacked him. This is partly because Tipu Sultan was allied with France in the Napoleonic Wars, and so the British saw him as a serious threat. There were 3 wars that the British waged against Mysore, and this king of Mysore, even though he looks old-fashioned on his throne, was a very forward-thinking king and actually experimented with rocket-propelled grenades, which he used against the British, and he held them off for a long time. But eventually, he was killed in 1799 by the British, and a few years before that, he had ceded control of Malabar province and the town of Calicut to the British as a result of these ongoing wars. His gold throne was melted down by the British East India Company to pay its soldiers. It was too heavy to ship back to England, but the homa bird, the gold and jewel-studded bird that was on the top of that parasol that's over his head, was sent back to England. It's now part of the Windsor family's royal collection. The Queen of England has it. Books and artwork conquered from the Mysore kingdom became the property of the East India Company and then the British Crown. And we know that the Arabic manuscript that Roxani, Margariti, and I translated of this legend was taken from Mysore and the Malabar area around this time and incorporated into the British holdings, first in Madras, and then a copy of it was made in Calcutta. And those ended up in London, where we can see them today. So it's not beyond conjecture that the painting that we're seeing of the Indian king indicating the splitting of the moon may also have come from this region of the Deccan at the end of the Mughal Empire or during the time of the Sultanate of Mysore, and that it was taken by British colonialists when they took over this region and became part of the colonial and now global heritage. So now that you know a little bit more about the importance of moon imagery and the significance of the Prophet Muhammad's story of pointing at the moon and splitting it, and its surprising links to the legend of the first king of Malabar who converted to Islam, you can go to the Wondrous World exhibit, either online or in person, and view the objects there with new, fresh eyes. And when you do that, you may find surprising examples of moon imagery everywhere you look. And Roxani and I compiled a quick visual odyssey of textiles from Burkina Faso in West Africa, which feature the moon. jewelry from Morocco, which features the crescent moon. These are all in the Wondrous Worlds exhibit. Bidri ware, metalware from the Deccan area of South India, which features a crescent moon. And finally, the most gorgeous piece of Arabic calligraphy, which is also in the exhibit, which is a translation of a couplet by a medieval Arabic poet from Alexandria, Ibn Qalaqis. And the line that is translated here in English as, if you travel if you aspire to renown, it's by roaming the skies that the crescent becomes a full moon. In Arabic, the line is Safir, إذا قصدت قدرا صار الهلال وصار بدرا. So visually there, you get the idea of a sail and the winds that take you across the seas. And we thought that was the perfect way to end our talk today about surprising connections between Arabia and South India across the sea, the richness of those spice trade routes, the early spread of Islam to South India through trade and conversion and miracle stories, not through conquest. And finally, the surprising background to that late Mughal portrait of a king, a poet, or maybe a saint, but we think it was a king, pointing to the splitting of the moon.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Roxani, for that fabulous journey. And thank you also for sharing so many images from the exhibition with images of the moon. And last night, Scott did our Carlos Museum book club, and we were talking about all the images of the birds that one can see throughout the exhibit. So I do hope you'll come. While we're waiting for people to put questions in the chat, please, or I'm sorry, in the Q&A, I just have a question for the two of you. And I wondered, when you were looking at researching all of this for this talk, was this a popular subject for paintings, or is this something that was rather unique? Did you find other paintings of the legend of the splitting of the moon?
There are very few paintings, actually, at least. And again, this is work in progress. So we are researching this at the moment. It seems that it wasn't a very common theme, although we have to take into account that many of the manuscripts had varied fates after they were used, and they ended up dispersed partly through the machinations of colonial overtakes in a number of places. And so many of them are in museums today, dispersed as single pages. So there may have been more, and there are definitely more, and some of them may have been the painting of the splitting of the moon. Just recently looking for different paintings, we located one which we're now trying to see live in a manuscript, but it's a late manuscript, a 19th century manuscript. So it is a relatively rare subject, I would say.
Thank you. We're delighted that Catherine M. Paul, who's the former curator at the Newark Museum, now at the Birmingham Museum of Art, who actually curated this show for the Newark Museum, is with us today. Hi, Katie. And she has a question asking, do you think that the date palm in the quote relates to the date palm in the painting?
That's a good question. Roxani, should I venture an answer?
Please, because yes.
I don't know if it's a direct relation, but certainly the date palm is a powerful symbol of prosperity and livelihood. You know, in the Qur'an, date palms are extraordinarily important. And Mary, for instance, when she is pregnant with Jesus all alone, the Qur'an says that she was anxious and hungry and worried, and a voice told her, go to the date palm and shake it. And dates fell down for her to eat, and a spring of water appeared at the roots of the palm for her to drink from. So, so yeah, date palms, you know, are a scriptural image of prosperity and a kind of wealth that comes directly from God's blessing. So I think that's why it appears so often. But Catherine, I don't know that the date palm there in the portrait is somehow directly linked to the moon in the Falnama image.
Thank you, Scott. There's another question. Perhaps the water waves in the sky are a reflex of the firmament of heavens from Genesis 1:6-7. Does the Quran also speak of God separating the heavens from the earth by a firmament, dividing the waters above from the waters below?
Roxani, you're going to take that question?
There's definitely the two seas, right?
Yes.
So the separation of waters, I'm not sure.
There are various, yeah, you know, the Quran talks about the creation of the world in various ways in different places. There's not one narrative like the Genesis narrative. And that in general, that's the nature of the Quran. It doesn't tell a story from start to end as a chronicle. And so there are many images of God creating the skies and then unrolling the ground, the earth, and then creating the oceans and talking about the blessings of the oceans and the ability that we have to travel on the oceans in ships. Those are all things mentioned by the Quran. But a kind of step-by-step creation of separating the water of the air from the water of the sea, I don't know that it's mentioned exactly like that.
And I can't help but wonder if that ambiguity between the clouds versus waves, which kept you and Roxani in conversation for quite some time, is intentional on the part of the artist. Is it possible that it could be either, depending on what the viewer saw?
You see,
Yeah.
It would be wonderful to have other paintings of, we're still also students of that, of trying to figure out what other paintings we can compare so that we could have similar iconographic gestures. But so for now, this is that's exactly what I also thought, Elizabeth, the idea of the ambiguity, that there's a little bit of both on purpose in some ways, but I'm not sure.
I would add that having a kind of ambiguous or mysterious background is a characteristic of Deccan paintings. There are kind of sub-traditions within Islamic painting in India. And the Deccan school of art tends to have very vivid colors and sometimes rather mysterious or misty backgrounds. And so that's why I think, you know, this painting gets labeled as Mughal era, but it may, the visual tradition of producing it might have been done by Deccan artists, just judging by the style. Yeah.
All right. Thank you both so much. I'm so grateful to you for making time for this and sharing your expertise, and for all the help that you've been with this beautiful exhibition. And I hope you have a lovely evening. Thank you all.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.